Hear now a word from the Gospel of Luke, the 15th chapter. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to hear him, and the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling and saying, "This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them." So he told them this parable. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the property, my share of the property that will belong to me." So he divided his property between them, and a few days later, the younger son gathered all that he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, and here I am dying of hunger? I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he went off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and he put his arms around him and kissed him. And then the son said, 'Father, I have sinned against you and heaven. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now, his elder brother was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. And he replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he got him back safe and sound.' And then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command, yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' And then the father said, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.' May these words be to us our light and life. Unfortunately, the average temperature of the earth is now hotter by 1 degree Celsius from what it was in the late 19th century. Fortunately, at the Paris Climate Summit, 195 nations pledged to limit the rise in global temperatures to no more than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial averages. Unfortunately, the methane emissions from polar ice melt are producing global warming feedback loops that will keep the planet in a fragile balance for centuries to come. Fortunately, global greenhouse gas emissions have flatlined in the last few years, possibly signifying that emissions will peak sooner than expected. I don't mean to get flip and make light of something as serious as climate change, but when the message is so grim, we almost need the structure of an old-fashioned melodrama to remind ourselves that it's not all bad news. Which is kind of where I found myself as I was reflecting on this very famous story from Luke. The prodigal son who squanders his inheritance in a distant country and ends up feeding the pigs. When he realizes that the pigs are eating better than he is, he swallows his pride, he humbles himself, he goes home. It's important to the story that when the son realizes his folly, there is some place for him to go to. Although he has wasted his inheritance, there is still a home to which he can return. But what happens if the squandered inheritance is creation itself? What happens if there is no home to return to? What are the symbols of forgiveness if there are no fatted calves left? How do we reconcile with our Creator when the severe famine is not limited to the distant country, but extends to the planet itself? The word prodigal has a couple of meanings. On the one hand, it refers to the reckless and wastefully extravagant use of money or resources. On the other hand, it refers to giving something generously on a lavish scale. And both senses are present in the biblical story. The father is generous in bestowing his son's inheritance and then lavish in welcoming him home. The son is reckless in his use of the inheritance, wasting it in dissolute living. And both senses are present in the scenario I am offering. God has created a world out of God's generosity, lavishly filling it with abundant resources. And God has given this world to us. And what have we done with this inheritance? We have squandered it, exhausted its resources, laid waste to it. We have lived in a distant country of desire and consumption, dissociating ourselves from the reality of the earth beneath our feet. And in that distant country, we spin out narratives of a stable, uninterrupted future. Our lives will continue as they are and as they will be for our children and our grandchildren. After all, we live in a world where, for the most part, things are stable and under control. Even the tumult of campaign politics is taking place in a world where we can safely assume that there will be food on the shelves at the grocery store, gas at the pump, familiar schedules of work and school, dependable routines. And if something happens to us that disrupts this, we see it as a temporary break in a story that we can then resume. Here's a way to look at it. We are mired in a narrative of an unbroken future. Unlike Europeans who within living memory fought 2 horrendous wars on their own soil, or Middle Eastern peoples whose wars are ongoing, our imaginations have been stunted, fixed on things more or less continuing as they always have been. Here's another way to look at it. We live in a distant country of unexamined assumptions and presuppositions. Let me tell you a story. A moment ago, I used the word mired. Many of you know that I put together a book of Lenten reflections this year, reflections I'd written a few years back that included some examples by Howard Thurman, the amazing African-American theologian of the past mid-century. One of Thurman's reflections, published in 1953, starts this way: "Are you a reservoir, or a canal, or a swamp?" I thought these were wonderfully evocative metaphors. We can be reservoirs, resources for ourselves and others. We can be canals, making connective links, or swamps, where things are stale and rot. And then I was called out. In a state where wetlands are prized and people fight to retain them, how could I so denigrate them? At first I was defensive. I didn't write it. It's a metaphor. It's been around for 70 years, long before swamps became wetlands. And then I was thoughtful. I grew up playing in swamps, And later, I applauded those trying to preserve wetlands, but I never made the connection myself, like the right brain not knowing what the left brain was thinking. Swamps are wetlands. Duh. And then I thought some more. Just because it was written 70 years ago doesn't mean I can thoughtlessly reprint it. There are a whole lot of things that were written that long ago that I would never reprint. And to be clear, I doubt Howard Thurman would either. He was a righteous man, Brother Thurman, and he would have had a word or two to say to us on climate change. At this point, I realized I was mired in ignorance, living in a distant country of unquestioned presuppositions. Wetlands, it turns out, remove, or transform pollutants through physical, chemical, and biological processes, and they are essential to healthy rivers, lakes, and streams. And they are threatened not just by covetous developers, but by derogatory language that consistently devalues them. As this country and the rest of the world are slowly, finally, waking up to the reality of climate change, a reality that some of us have been calling us out on for decades, we are finding ourselves in that sty with the prodigal. Realization has dawned. The narrative of same old has broken. And now what? Take a moment to a break, to lament, and then back to business as usual? You know what the prodigal does? He interrupts his own story. He doesn't just take a break, he stops. He repents, which is to say, he turns. Remember that the Greek word for repentance is metanoia, and it signifies a turning of the self, a transformation that is so complete that we cannot but see things differently from that point on. He goes home. As long as we are mired in the distant country of uninterrupted narratives of our future, we will regard interruptions as inconveniences, mere breaks from the ongoing story, which, of course, will resume. But when swamps become wetlands, so to speak, when dead metaphors become unexpected sources of biodiversity and life, we can interrupt the narrative of American expectation and consumption. And as it turns out, there is a theology of interruption that runs throughout the Bible. It is found in a burning bush, an unexpected pregnancy, a road to Damascus. In the story of the boy Samuel, it's clear where this interruption comes from. It is the voice of God. Remember what Eli counsels Samuel to say when he hears the voice calling to him? Say, "Here am I, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." We hear those words as signifying readiness, but they are also about location. Here am I in this spot, in this temple, or in this pigsty, or mired in this old metaphor, but here I am, and I am ready to respond. What we don't always remember is that location is also, it's not just a particular place, it also designates time. This morning, we're located here on the corner of McAllister and Lincoln, but we are also located in this time, in this moment of history, with this set of challenges, limited to these possibilities. In other words, God calls us not just where we are, but when we are. And a faithful response, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening," must also address the demands of our particular era. Like Frodo, we can wish climate change were not happening in our time. And like Gandalf, we can say, "So do I, and so do all who live to see such things." But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. We are here in this particular spot, on this particular morning, because we are people of more or less faith, but we have enough to know that time is also the medium in which God moves and acts. As people of faith, we recognize that interruption disrupts the established hierarchies of power, the dark and steady pull of habit, the stable narrative. Interruption breaks into our thought patterns, giving us the possibility to learn something new, to open pathways to justice, to experience beauty, compassion, and grace. And as people of faith, we recognize that time can be interrupted at any point by redemption. An exodus can begin, a Christ revealed in company shared with tax collectors and sinners. And so, along with the theology of interruption, there is a deep spiritual and ethical practice of interruption, which is illustrated in this parable. It calls us as moral agents to stop our prodigal ways and accept the challenge of a different future. And here's where things get poignant. Remember what I said earlier, that it's important to the story of the prodigal that when he realizes his folly, there is some place for him to go to. Although he has wasted his inheritance, there is still a home to which he can return. And I asked, what happens if the squandered inheritance is creation itself? Most of us will die in a world vastly different from the world we were born into. That we will die is not important. That's always been part of the human story. What matters is the living part. How we live, what meaning we give to our lives by our relationships, our actions, our determination to protect the vulnerable, our willingness to rise up. What matters is whether we have built up a capacity for readiness, for openness to those moments when God speaks. I don't know the future, but as a person of faith, I know that despair is not an option. The atheist is the one who says, there's nothing that can be done. And I am not an atheist. As I see it, as people of faith, we have some strengths and insights to offer to these particular times. We know a larger story arc of mortality, brokenness, and redemption. We know that God works in and throughout creation, and thus nature itself is engaged with us in this struggle. We know that sometimes the most ordinary and unlikely people are empowered to do the most unexpected, extraordinary things. We know that we can't silence our prophetic voices. That fish will always spit us out on the shores of Nineveh. And we know that a road to the impossible is always open. The people repented, and God did save that city despite Jonah's prophecy. Unfortunately, the son had to live through very difficult times in order to recognize his folly. Fortunately, the really essential part of the story is the surprising turn it takes at the end, when love opens a new future, far from the pigsty, for the returning son. The story declares that what was dead was alive again, what was lost has been found, and so may it be for us.